Let me come to yours. Right, the mule stuff is fun. Oh yeah, it's fine for me. I can feel like I'm a celebrity in the spotlight.
Okay, we can get started now. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Peacedale Museum of Art and Culture, South County's oldest museum. I'm Lisa Fiore, President of the Board of Trustees, where I work with fellow trustees to preserve this museum as a historic perspective of the world around us 100 plus years ago. The artifacts on display are from many cultures throughout the world, raising awareness of the complexities and similarities of the global population. Our mission's focus is education. Our talented and enthusiastic Vice President, Mary Cockcroft Brown, has developed wonderful education programs for school-aged children, as well as the Peacedale Village Walking Tour. Mary trustees Louise Weaver, Betsy Cook, Linda Hennessy, Jan Rothstein, along with our administrator, Julie Wardwell. We have found that the museum can make a lasting impression on these young students. We often have former students return years or for many decades later with their own family. This experience is very rewarding to all of us. Tonight's stellar speaker series continues our mission of education to the community. Kudos to Karen Ellsworth, fellow board trustee who is responsible for the speaker series and is our editor and creator of our fabulous newsletter. For those of you who don't have a copy, we have them right here. This team of volunteers works to keep history alive and well. Tonight we kick off our spring speaker series with one of our favorites, Roger Williams University history professor, Dr. Charlotte Carrington-Farmer.
Thank you. Hey.
As Rhode Islanders, Roger Williams Park is one of those places we fondly remember. Did any of us stop to think about its origins and the lovely historic cottage belonging to Betsey Williams? Tonight, Charlotte will enlighten us as to who this fascinating, independent woman, Betsey Williams, was and her place in Rhode Island history, or should it be her story? Welcome.
Thank you. I love it. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? I ask because I wear hearing aids, and so I know how it is to sit in the audience and not be able to hear. So if you can't hear me, do let me know. It truly is a joy to be back here. It's been a couple of years since I've been here, and I'm always thrilled when you ask me to come back. So as you can hear, I'm not a Rhode Islander, born and bred. I didn't come here on a school trip. But I am a historian of Rhode Island and New England history, and I've been thinking about Roger Williams, the namesake of the university I teach at, for half of my life, all of my adult life. So as an undergraduate student in the UK, I took a class, I'm 41, so over 21 years ago, on Puritanism in the Atlantic world, and Roger Williams was one of the people we studied. There are chairs just here. I then wrote my undergraduate dissertation on Roger Williams in England. He was a part of my master's. He was then part of my PhD, and then I got the job at Roger Williams University 12 years ago and moved to Rhode Island because of the job. And so as a historian of early American history, this love of Roger Williams has continued. I published a book chapter on Roger Williams called Roger Williams and the Architecture of Religious Liberty a couple of years ago. And then I have a book on Roger Williams actually coming out with Broadview called Roger Williams and His World. That will be out later this year. It's under contract. It will be out in October, so I'll come back and talk about that at some point. But in March 2020, two things happened that changed my trajectory. Obviously, COVID happened in March 2020, but just before we went into lockdown, Plymouth Patuxent Museums out in Plymouth, Mass, formerly Plymouth Plantation, reached out to me and said, you know, you've been studying Roger Williams for a long time now. Would you come and give a talk for Women's History Month on his wife, Mary? And I was like, sure, you know. And it was that type of thing where I kind of said yes without really thinking about it. And being a bit of a lazy historian at that time, I was on sabbatical. That didn't happen, obviously, with COVID. I thought I could just put something together, you know, it's no big lift. And then the more digging I did, the more I was like, there's really nothing on Mary. And so I'm so happy to say, because of that invitation in March 2020, got a journal article that will be out in the New England Quarterly this autumn called More Than Roger's Wife, Mary Williams and the Founding of Providence. And so, you know, that led me to Betsey, right? So this is why I'm telling you this. You know, I was trying to think of a way to end my article and thinking about how women have been overlooked, particularly in the Williams family, and how, you know, they were actually way more important than we realized in the founding and maintaining of Providence. And so that's what led me to Betsey, truthfully, in the 19th century. So I want to talk to you a little bit tonight about Mary Williams, Roger's wife, in the 17th century, and how I've tried to make that connection between her and her relative, you know, a couple of hundred years apart. So this is what I'm going to talk to you about this evening. I have to start by saying thank you to Karen. Please, you should give her a round of applause. As you know, she and I were emailing back and forth about topics and what I could talk about, and this is one of the ones I threw out, and she immediately said, please do this, I'm really interested in this. And I feel like that is the biggest understatement I've heard in a long time. You know, every week she would say, hey, did you know this about Betsey? I found this, what about this? And I was like, my mind was blown. And so a lot of the stuff that I'm going to share to you tonight, and I'll point this out along the way, has come from a lot of the work that Karen has done. So I'm very much a 17th century historian. I was joking as I came in that, and here we are in the 19th century. So really so much of this has been the digging that Karen has done. So thank you. So I want to start with Betsey's death. And then I want to work back from Betsey's death to Mary's life in the 17th century, and then come back to Betsey's life, and then come back to her death at the end. So I'm going to signpost geographically and chronologically where we're going to be. So I want to start with the death of Betsey Williams, right? So Betsey Williams died on the 28th of November, 1871, and she is Roger, who founded Providence, and his amazing wife Mary's great-great-great-granddaughter. And I have to count it out every time how many greats to make sure I get it right. And this is what the local newspaper said about her death, right? So, death of a descendant of Roger Williams, Miss Betsey Williams, died yesterday at her residence in the 9th Ward near the Cranston line, aged 82 years. It's understood that the opening of her will disclosed the fact that the venerable lady has bequeathed the city of Providence the farm upon which she died, estimated to be worth now $40,000, upon the condition that the city erect a monument to cost no less than $500 to the memory of Roger Williams in the old Williams burial ground. So this is that groundbreaking moment when, you know, they open up her will, and this is that first step into what leads to what is now known as Roger Williams Park and Zoo to being created. So this is Betsey's bequest in her will. And this is what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about later, like how did this woman get this land, like what was the impact of the will, like what was her life like, etc., etc., etc. But before Betsey, I want to take you back to Mary Williams, and notice how in this she's described just as a descendant of Roger Williams, right? And she insists basically that the monument has got to be to Roger Williams, right? So, you know, it's all about the man, right? Even as Betsey's dying, she's insisting Roger be remembered. But I want to try and make the point to you this evening that before Betsey, Mary Williams, who has been completely overlooked in the historical record, simply known as Roger's wife, she actually, I think, made Betsey's gift possible. So without Mary in the 17th century, we couldn't get to this gift. So this is not a talk about Mary Williams, but I feel like we need to know the 17th century context before we get to the 19th. So when I started my work on Mary Williams in March 2020, all of the archives were closed, right? So I was so excited 2 years later when I got to go to Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston to see what is, as far as we know, the only surviving copy of Mary Williams' handwriting. And this is it, right? It says, "For my dear and loving husband," and then it's scribbled out, right? That's it, right? So can you see on here, it's folded, right? And there's writing on the back. So this is Mary's address on an unsent packet, which essentially is in the 17th century, you don't have separate envelopes to post your letter, you write it and you fold it and you seal it. So you can see the folds are here, but it never got sent, okay? And what's scribbled out, it says Roger Williams at Narragansett, so like, you know, down in Narragansett country where we are here this evening. And so this is it. "For my dear and loving husband," scribbled out. How on earth have I got a journal article out of, you know, these handful of words on an unsent letter? It's been hard, I'll tell you. So I mean, I think it's really important to say the fact that we do have these words shows that Mary could not only just read, right, which we knew, but actually she could write. And literacy in the 17th century, we tend to think today of reading and writing go together, but for women, certainly they were seen as separate skills. So the fact that Mary was literate, I think, is huge. And so this is the only surviving copy of Mary's handwriting. And what's on the back of this actually is pretty tantalizing. It's Roger Williams writing to John Winthrop Jr. about the death penalty for adultery. And at first I was like, oh my God, is there like a affair in the Williams family? Is this why she scribbles his name out? No. Like, that would be fascinating. It's not true. And one of the things, I teach a class on Mary Williams and her world. One of the things that we also talk about is how Roger Williams' earliest surviving correspondence from 1629 are love letters. Not to his wife Mary, but to another woman, Jane Whaley. And Mary's in the household at the same time. And like, so we always think of Roger as this like, you know, theologian writing about separation of church and state. His earliest surviving correspondence are love letters. He proposes to another woman, Jane Whaley. He's not allowed to marry her because he's not of high enough social status. He writes these really terrible letters to her high status aunt, Lady Joan Barrington, saying, "You're old and grey and your hourglass is running out." It's painful. It's cringeworthy. And then those letters are from April, May 1629, and then he marries Mary that December. So is she his rebound? I mean, she's in the household working as a maid, so maybe. Anyway, you should read my article. It'll be out in October. So anyway, so I make this point about the adultery because Jane Whaley, his first love, actually moves over to New England. So I was like, oh, no. So this is the earliest surviving correspondence, and this is a discussion about the death penalty for adultery. But the argument I make quite seriously in the article about Mary is that separation defined Mary's life. She was away from her husband for months and years at a time, which means that she alone made many of the decisions that affected her family, her community, and the town of Providence. So, you know, Roger is away when she writes this letter, presumably down here at his trading post, or at least in Indian country, in Narragansett country. And whilst he's away tending to Indian affairs, Mary's in charge of all of these things. And so I think it's really powerful that we have this. And, you know, we know so much about Roger Williams, right? Like, there are so many books and articles, and the university and the park and the zoo and the Roger Williams National Memorial. We've got statues to him in the US Capitol, you know, the one on the Reformation Wall in Geneva. He's even been on a stamp, right? But where are the statues to Mary? What about Betsey, right? Like, I think we need to think about this. And so for Mary then, this is what one early 20th century biographer of Roger said, you know, who was this lady? It's not known. And save that her name was Mary and that she proved to him a true and loyal wife, the record is meagre. Well, you've seen the record, it is meagre, right? I've not got a surprise source for you, that's it. But as I say to you, Mary was head of the family and faced many solo challenges for months and years at a time. And throughout half a century of marriage, Mary makes many of those decisions when Roger is either away at his trading post, in Indian country doing business, or even where he spends several years petitioning the Crown and the Parliament for Rhode Island's charter. So I just want to give you a snapshot of Mary's life and how that pertains to Betsey's life in the 19th century. So Mary grew up at Worksop Priory in Nottinghamshire in England, which is 20 minutes drive from where I'm from, so the timing is perfect. And the medieval gatehouse still stands, and if you're interested, I can show you some pictures at the end. So she grew up in this medieval gatehouse. She then went to work in a lavish manor house, but she ended up living in a really crowded one-room house in Providence. In the first half of her life, she moved to 5 places on 2 sides of the Atlantic during the first 27 years of her life. And then for the second half, she stayed put in Providence, apart from a brief break down to Aquidneck Island in 1675 in the midst of the war. Her childhood in England was defined by religious persecution. Her father, Richard Bernard, lost his job multiple times for challenging the established church before doing full circle and coming back to the established church, unlike her husband. So she lives her life as a kid in England, witnessing firsthand the persecution of the state on the church, right? And then she lives the second half of her life in Providence, in the freest place potentially in the Western world at the time. Her training at Oates Manor in Essex, where she met Roger, trained her to run a lavish manor house. In Providence, she lived in a one-room house where her hosting skills were hosting Indigenous leaders. And I also wonder, I speculate in the article, if she at least had some skills in the Narragansett language, because she had an unfree Pequot boy living in her house. She was hosting Canonicus and the Antinomy regularly. Like, I don't think it's a stretch to think that she would have had at least some proficiency in the Narragansett language, and we know other women in Providence were able to speak the language, so it's not a stretch. And as I said to you, she went from being she was his, you know, his the love of his life, and she was his rebound, to going to be his dearest love. So there's some contradictions. And as I talk about in the article, she plays a key role in the Pequot War in 1637, where she saves a soldier's life. And then she nearly dies of an unknown illness a few years later. And again, that's one of the written records that Roger writes a letter to his wife, Mary Williams, and then publishes it as a book called Experiments in Spiritual Health. And it's written all about Mary's illness. She plays a central role in the colony in terms of her medical knowledge, and as I'm going to talk to you about tonight, confirming this crucial land evidence in 1661 that enables Betsey to then bequeath the land, you know, in the 19th century. We know Mary faced financial hardships and she relied on the charity from friends, but she also profited as her family sold Indigenous peoples into slavery. So there's a real contradiction here. And I can talk certainly more about the slavery issue in the Q&A. It's something that in my book, you know, the book I'm writing on Roger Williams, that, you know, I've really had to grapple with. So I can certainly talk about that. Mary spent large amounts of time away from Roger, right, like years, and some of my favourite letters that have survived are Roger, when he's on a 3-year trip to England trying to secure the charter, begging her to come over to England to join him. She does not. She makes a decision to stay. I mean, she's got like 6 kids at this point and a house to look after. Like, and it's dangerous, right? Like he writes in the letter, you know, I'll leave it up to you and your own free spirit to make your decision. So she knows her own mind. And as a kid in England, she saw her dad reluctantly conform to the established church. And then her husband obviously is banished for his refusal to do so. Last little bit of background on Mary before we dive into the land evidence from 1661. So it's clear then, obviously, that Roger's decisions have impacted the move, right? The decision to leave England in 1631 to go to Salem and Plymouth and back. But I actually make the argument in the article that actually some of it's Mary's connections through her father. As a child, she knew most of the people who eventually went on to found Plymouth Colony as separatists. So I wonder if that's part of the draw. We'll see a little bit later that Mary's father corresponds with really important people in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, namely Roger Williams' enemy, John Cotton. And like, why is there correspondence between Mary's father and one of Roger's enemies and nothing that survived between Roger and his father-in-law? Has it just not survived? Maybe. Or did his father-in-law cut ties when he got banished, right? That's what I wonder. And then Roger's banishment in 1635, Mary was heavily pregnant. She gives birth to their second child in October 1635. That's the same month that her husband gets his banishment for his new and dangerous opinions. But there's a letter from a few years later that describes how, at least hypothetically, if not practically, Roger did not allow Mary to hear the word with them in their home because she potentially carried on going to the Salem church after Roger refused to go. So she knows her own mind in a way that we just haven't, I think, really realised. And we always think about Roger and he's this kind of lone hero, right, in the grand founding of Providence. It's like traditional great man history at its greatest. And, I'm such a social cultural historian, I want to talk about women's history and bottom-up history, that I'm so happy to say that the research I've done on Mary really does show she plays an important role in the founding of Providence and in guiding Indigenous diplomacy. And I want to talk to you about Mary's role in confirming a land evidence in 1661 as a way to link her to Betsey, who's the subject of my talk tonight. So the 1660s in Providence, I can sum up in a word: a nightmare. Right? It was a mess, right? Everyone was falling out. And the main thing they were falling out about was land, right? The colony has continued to grow as more people have moved, right? And there's all kinds of disputes. And again, I think it's important to say that the land, obviously, that they were on belonged to native peoples, right? It was only because of Canonicus and the Antinomy that they were able to found Providence in the first place. And again, I can talk more about what that original land evidence meant for native peoples. And again, obviously thinking tonight that we're obviously on Narragansett native land here. So anyway, the 1660s were a nightmare. All of these other settler colonists had moved to Providence. We saw expansion down the West Bay. And the thing they're arguing about is who has what land? What are the bounds of this? What were the bounds of the original settlement that Canonicus and the Antinomy are already gifted in 1636, then were written and confirmed 2 years later in 1638? And the records, they're just going backwards and forwards. Who has this land? Was this and this and this? And so in 1661, in December, they bring in Mary Williams to testify as to what the original bounds of the settlement of Providence was. And I didn't know that. That blew my mind when I learned that. I was like, of all the people they bring in Mary, which again, it doesn't say this in the record, but be reading between the lines, that makes me think she was there in 1636 when Canonicus and the Antinomy were talking to Roger about what the terms of that agreement would be. Why else would they ask her to confirm it? And so I'll show you the original document, but I just want to clarify, this is what the document she signed says. It says she confirmed then the bounds of the land, and she describes in the document, the outline of the colony. It's from this part of the land to this, and the river, etc., etc. But she confirmed that it had been founded, quote, as a shelter for persons distressed of conscience, and how they sought, quote, loving and peaceable neighbourhood with the natives round and about us. Roger, her husband, was the procurer of the purchase, not by monies nor payment, but by that language, acquaintance and favour with the natives and other advantages which it pleased God to give me. And again, as I say, this talks about Betsey, but if you're interested in that, as I say, I feel like I've spent so much time on Roger recently, I can answer any questions you have about that. And so this is the document from 1661. it's long, right? I just read you an excerpt, but this is a bit that we're interested in down here, and I've zoomed in. So it says, I, Mary Williams, wife unto Roger Williams, and she basically consents to witness by my hand, and you can see, you know, the year, etc., the mark of M.W. Mary Williams. And so I feel like we knew about this, right? Like, we knew about it, but I hadn't seen the manuscript copy until a year or two ago, right? I'd seen a typed out version. And one of the historians who wrote about Mary said, you know, well, she clearly couldn't write, right? She just signed with initials, so she's not literate, she can't write. And then, you know, I found that document up in the archives at Massachusetts Historical Society, and then I started reading letters from Roger Williams to other people, and many of those letters say, by my wife I told you, by my wife I sent, this letter I sent to my wife. So it seems like she can. And, you know, I did a lot of reading on secondary sources that other historians have written about women's literacy, and one of the points they make is that even in a record like this, which is a land evidence, people often just sign with their initials because it's quicker, it's easier, and it's not necessarily a sign of illiteracy, right? Like, I'm thinking about, like, the other day I had to sign for the taxes and my husband wasn't there, so I could sign his name but put my initials next to it, right? So, you know, I think about the times that we get to just initial things, and I think, you know, the literature on this suggests that that's just probably what was going on there. So it's not necessarily a mark of her inability to write. So Mary had 6 children, and, you know, I say this to my students all the time, like, birthdays weren't a thing in the 17th century, and it always upsets them. They're like, well, what did they do? I was like, oh, it's not a thing. And most of the time we know when people were born because of baptism records, right? Like, we can, so for Roger Williams, we have no idea actually when he was born. We estimate it was around 1603 because his baptism records were burnt in the Great Fire of London in 1666 when St Sepulchre's Church, his parish church, burned. We know when Mary was born because her church records have survived in Worksop. Now, those 6 children that Roger and Mary have are kind of exceptional because in the early Providence town records, this is Roger's handwriting. Roger recorded the birth of the 6 kids and basically says, you know, roughly when they were born. Like, it says, like, at the end of October and, you know, about the month of September. So the Williams family children are pretty extraordinary in that we have a clear idea of when they were born. And so there's been some confusion actually between Mercy and Daniel. Like, can you see that it says July 1640 and then February 1641? How does that work, right? It doesn't. It doesn't is the answer. Everyone's brain was going. And again, for quite a while, there was like misinformation about those dates. But if you know the 17th century, as Roger quite kindly reminds us, that the new year begins in March. So when you see a date from the 17th century that's in the first, you know, 3 months of the year, it's actually the following year. So that's why it works. But again, so understanding these documents is important. And I'm a historian, I'm not a genealogist. So please don't ask me any genealogy questions. It is not my strong suit. Come to me with history, not genealogy. If you're interested in genealogy, Roger Williams Family Association, is anyone a member? I am, right? I've got my pin on. I'm clearly not a descendant, but they made me an honorary member a few years ago, so I thought I'd wear my pin. Go to the Roger Williams Family Association. They published several volumes of genealogy, and please do check out their website. So it's through the family that I can now get to Betsey. So this is the death notice that I just started with. And I want to just kind of pick out some things about her life. So newspapers are one of my favorite primary sources, right? Like Karen and I have been talking about how you get so much gossip from the newspapers. And honestly, it's like picking up like the scandalous tabloids of today. Like, I spend hours, like, I'm writing, I do a lot of work on horse history, and I'll be looking for horses, and then something on the same sheet will catch my eye. and like hours of my life have gone by. So I want to share another newspaper article that was published a few months after Betsey passes away in November. So this is from the 19th of February the following year. And it described then, I'm going to zoom in a second, the heir of Miss Betsey Williams as a very eccentric lady, a lineal descendant of Roger Williams. And let's just zoom in. One of the things that this weird and wonderful article said was that she was of unsound mind. And again, this is something Karen and I have corresponded about. That in her will, she left the greater portion of her property to the city. There's been a suit for its recovery on the grounds that she was of unsound mind when the will was drawn. And then it says in this article that one of her eccentricities is said to be being a queer religious belief. And I was like, what? I was like, Roger Williams, who founds a place for religious freedom, has a descendant, and they're criticizing her eccentric religious belief. I was like, I couldn't make this up. So it says here, I'm going to just pick out some bits from the source then. So it says the heirs of Miss Betsey Williams, a very eccentric lady, a lineal descendant of Roger Williams, who died recently in Providence, Rhode Island, and left the greater portion of her property, and it talks about the property, is about to enter a suit for its recovery in this city on the grounds that she was of unsound mind when it was drawn. I was like, what? And then it describes the bounds, etc., etc. It describes that it shall bear the name of Roger Williams forever. They've got to erect a monument to Roger Williams in the Williams burial ground. And then this bit is where I was drinking my tea, and I literally had to put my cup down and just walk away. So it said this. One of her eccentricities is said to have been a queer religious belief. Every morning after breakfast, it was her custom to have 3 inverted cups placed on a quaintly constructed altar, which she called the Trinity of Holy Tea Leaves. And there she solemnly worshipped for an hour. I was like, what? And then it basically says, etc., 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 so that her suing relatives also say on the subject of cleanliness, would there be, more, etc., 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 and then it says here, and made visitors remove their shoes in the hall before entering her immaculate presence, and being profoundly impressed with the belief that Roger Williams and George Washington were the greatest men that ever lived, she required everyone who came into her house to honor their memories by reverently bowing and refraining from sitting in the presence of the portraits, which hung in many conspicuous places on the walls. And I was like, what? You like I almost imagine like fortune tellers, right? Like you read the tea leaves. So she's got these tea leaves. She's there for an hour. I get the taking your shoes off, right? She's super clean. But she's got these portraits, apparently, of George Washington and Roger Williams. And you can't sit in their presence. And my first question is this. I was like, did she have a portrait of Roger Williams? Because famously, he never sat for one, right? He thought it was the height of vanity. And I was like, again, so going through her will, that was my first question as I saw the will. I was like, is there a portrait of Williams that we could potentially have from a descendant? No, is the answer. Not so far anyway. And then basically, though she was rich, she lived the plainest and scantiest of lives. She never wrote to any of her relatives. And I was like, oh, okay. Because she was convinced the use of paper envelopes and postage stamps would certainly ruin her. So I was like, what's going on with the family here? She was nevertheless an attractive old lady, I was like, all right, who had her own ideas of life and lived in accordance with them. And that really resonated with me, right? As we'll see, we're going to test out. My question is, how true was that, right? Like, is this a true depiction of Betsey Williams? But this line that she had her own ideas of life and lived in accordance with them, I think is true, right? Like, I think she did, and I think that makes her important in the way that we'll talk about. But the rest of this, I want to pull this apart to see what we can actually tell about Betsey's life in the 19th century. So Betsey was born in 1790 to James and Mary Williams, obviously descendants of the Williams family. And they have this large 100-odd acre farm. And she has a couple of siblings, Tennyhass Charles and her sister Rhoda. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about Rhoda tonight. when her father dies, Mary gets part of the farm, so the mom and then the children share the rest of the farm. And what happens is her brothers eventually move and sell out their shares, so that by 1825, the farm is managed by an amazing group of women. Right? I'd hoped to give this talk during Women's History Month, but my schedule was too complicated, so there's a real emphasis on like women's history here. Let's pretend it's still March. That was managed by Betsey and her sister Rhoda, and then obviously her mother Mary. And again, there's a lot of Mary. I'm not a genealogist, but the look through I've done is there's a lot of Marys paying homage to our original Mary Williams in the 17th century. So after the park was founded, they published a history of Roger Williams Park in 1897, and in that there's a bunch of descriptions about Betsey, right? And footnotes aren't a thing in this source in the 19th century, so it's not sure where this evidence comes from, but she's only been dead a few years, so I presume maybe talking to people, you know, other family members, community members. And the book of the park describes Betsey as follows, that she was tall and finely formed, with a fresh and fair complexion and dark blue eyes and rich auburn hair, who always wore an immaculate white kerchief crossed over her breasts in a very neat and precise manner. And then it describes in the book how Betsey and her sister Rhoda, quote, always dressed alike, clad in long plaid cape cloaks with bonnets and long veils, which was, quote, a quaint sight. So what's true, I think, is that Betsey and Rhoda, her sister, were very close. And I want to spend a bit of time talking about Rhoda because it's a really sad tale, truth be told. So Betsey never married, right? Betsey never married, but her sister Rhoda did. And she married a guy called James Straight from Warwick in 1815. I feel like if I could sum up James Straight in a word, I'd say he was, I don't know, actually, I was trying to think of a word, but they're all terrible words. He was a nightmare. He was an awful person, and then some more. So it's clear that before she married James Straight, Rhoda seemed to have some doubts to his character, and she seemed to wonder potentially if he was after money and potentially part of her inheritance. And in some documents I'll talk about in a second, it seems like from an interview that her mother Mary did that, you know, just before the wedding, Rhoda mortgaged off basically her section of the farm to her mother, you know, gets rid of any power that she has over the land and the money, but doesn't tell her soon-to-be husband. She does this right before the wedding. I've been married 10 years now. I've been with my husband 20 years together, 10 years married. And I told him this story and he's like, that doesn't bode well. And I was like, I know, right? It doesn't, it really doesn't. And then what happens is James and Rhoda live in the house with Betsey and the mother Mary. And so fast forward to 1817, this is a newspaper article that Karen shared with me. It says, whereas Rhoda Straight of Cranston, basically the wife of James Straight, it describes who he is, has filed her petition in the said office, basically, etc., 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 asking for a decree of divorce, so dissolving the matrimony. So, you know, she's married 2 years, right? And so the divorce petitions, I guess I would say to my students, I'm giving you a trigger warning, right? I'm about to talk about domestic violence, so I just want to say that to you. So it's quite unpleasant stuff. So the Supreme Judicial Court, the Judicial Archives in Pawtucket, have all of the original divorce stuff. And I spent some time reading this, and I felt like, again, I couldn't have tea, but like I felt like I had to walk away from some of these documents because it was really, really uncomfortable stuff. So you've got Rhoda's petition that I'll talk about, where she's justifying why she wants a divorce, and then a whole other bunch of people testify. Her mother Mary testifies why she should have a divorce. Betsey testifies. There's a whole bunch of other people. But I've been kind to you and transcribed this document. I'm not going to make you read this. I'll show you the transcription. So this is what Rhoda says about why she should be granted a divorce from James. So she says, quote, that she intermarried with said husband about 2.5 years ago, hoping and expecting to enjoy all that happiness, which is always anticipated and usually enjoyed in the marriage state. But all her hopes so fondly cherished have been blunted, and her most sanguine expectations disappointed. Her said husband has been sometimes guilty of intoxication and intemperance, that his affections for your petitioner, so Rhoda, has been gradually diminishing ever since her intermarriage with him, and that he's lost all regard and feeling for her, that her said husband is a man of sour and morose disposition, and that he has at times suffered his passion so far to overcome his reason as to break out into actual violence, that regardless of his most solemn vows, he has repeatedly assaulted, beaten, and abused your petitioner without cause or provocation, and has treated her with cruelty, that he has left her wholly, he has wholly left your petitioner refusing to live with her, and that he has lived with another woman for a considerable time, that her said husband has never provided necessaries for your petitioner since her intermarriage with him, but has left her to the charity of friends, that he has abused her with abusive language, and has been guilty of other gross misbehavior, wickedness repugnant to and in violation of the marriage covenant. So really bad stuff, right? And so I read Rhoda's petition first, and then I read the testimony of Betsey, right? So I was really truthfully only interested in Betsey. She's like a paragraph and a half at the end of my Mary article. And then kind of like I went down the rabbit hole with Rhoda when I was like, she tested, I was, oh my goodness. And I was joking with Karen, I was like, someone needs to write something on Betsey, Rhoda, and this, right? It's not going to be me, maybe I'm hoping it's going to be her. So this is what Betsey has to say, and it's a couple of pages long, right? Like it's quite a long testimony. And again, I've been kind to you and not making you read the handwriting. So I want to share Betsey's words about her sister Rhoda, and I want you to keep in mind that I wonder what would have happened as we learn more about what a terrible person James Strait was if Rhoda hadn't had the foresight to keep the land and the money out of the way, right? Like, I wonder what had happened if that Roger Williams part would have been there, and if, let's say, Betsey had died earlier. Like, I think it's fair to say it wouldn't be, is the honest answer. So I think, again, the power of women, even in these really difficult situations, is important to know. So this is what Betsey says to testify in her sister's divorce. She says, "My sister Rhoda Strait has been treated very unkindly by her husband in my presence. Not long after they were married, he began to show his temper and quarrelled with her. One time his temper ran very high and he pushed her against the side of the house and over the chair, which hurt her very much. She was not able to do any kind of work for 3 or 4 weeks. He kicked her several times. He got mad about his work and ordered her downstairs. And as she walked towards the stairs, he took a brush handle and pushed her off. As she went, she caught on her hands and feet. It gave her a very great shock, but it did not break any bones. He disturbed the house day and night. I and my mother and sister lost a great many nights' sleep by his quarrelling. He was always treated very kindly and very handsome in our house with every respect. He never received a cross word from his wife or any of our family to my knowledge. His wife has never been any kind of expense to him in any respect. He always came and went as he pleased and ate and drank the best the house could afford. One day he sat making a mortar, got his temper up very high and threw the mortar at her, at Rhoda. The mortar glanced away from her clothes and fell upon her foot. One day he was weaving himself a couple of harness shafts and threw at her, which gave her a slight wound upon her arm. He was also very unkind to her. In sickness talked very unhandsome to her and told her she was not sick to get up and wash and mend his clothes. He has talked very unhandsome to me many times. He carried his clothing and things away from our house. He never stayed at our home worth mentioning after the aforementioned of March last. I think she, Rhoda, did her duty to him in every respect." Well, that's 1817, right? They filed for the divorce in 1817. It doesn't get granted until 1820. by this point, James has moved in with another woman and fathered a child out of wedlock. And again, we can see this in the newspaper. So Rhoda is filing for divorce, and it's dated now here, obviously 1870, and this is therefore that notice, right? Presumably, she, where is this? How she's going to serve him? And then again, Karen was like, hey, I found some more gossip. And I was like, oh, what did you find this time? And again, like going back to James, he's a terrible, terrible person. So James goes on to marry Sophia Straight, and divorces them in 1824. And so Sophia Straight, residing in Cranston in the county of Providence, wife of James Straight, late of Cranston in the county of Providence, but now in parts to the said Sophia unknown. So again, like doing this disappearing act, has filed her petition basically praying for a decree of divorce from her said husband. And so again, he's notified this way. And again, like Karen's like, hey, I went down the Cranston town meeting stuff, and again, like there's this evidence of him fathering the child out of wedlock with Betsey Pratt, and one of the documents basically describes about who's going to pay for this child born out of wedlock. Essentially, the town is responsible for it, or the person who is basically who is held in bond for this. And so it's really, really fascinating, and I'm sure Karen can talk more about this in the Q&A. So I think it's really interesting to see. My talk is not about James Straight, but like maybe it could be at some point. Like, I think it's a really fascinating side note, right? That the talk is about Betsey Williams and doing good stuff and giving the land to Providence, but like there's this really sad tale, and I think this could have been a turning point for the women in the Williams family had James Straight got his hands on this land. It's certain to say that the park would not be there. All right, so let's get back to Betsey and Rhoda then. So they get rid of James Straight, thank goodness, and together the sisters live together for the rest of their lives. They care for their mother, Mary, until she passes away in 1826. 10 years later, they sell off 20-odd acres of land. They sell some of it to the New York, Providence, and Boston railroads. We know that in 1841, they bought a house over on Pontiac Avenue, and there's evidence of them, again, making money, renting out the cottage, the barn to tenants. And again, a lot of the stuff that's written about Betsey is written after she dies, when people are starting to write late 19th century histories of the park, and they often romanticize the life that these two sisters lived. But the sources suggest that they were very self-sufficient. They raised flax, they spent time spinning linen. There's definitely evidence they sold some of the goods that they fashioned. They, picked huckleberries, they made candles. So again, like two really industrious, self-sufficient women. Rhoda died in 1846, and then Betsey lives, right, until she's in her 80s. She lives right through till 1871. I want to go back and think about this reality, right? So again, piecing together from other sources, it is clear that she was well connected in the town of Providence in terms of the people who she is networking with, as evidenced by her will. Other sources suggest that she was strange and she was very exclusive, but truthfully, I think that's just like 19th century sexism, honestly. I think, again, piecing together from other sources that we have, it's clear that Betsey was actually a really astute businesswoman. And again, I've got a quote from one of the late 19th century sources that describes, quote, depending solely upon her own judgment and ability, which seldom, if ever, failed her. They describe how Betsey, quote, treated people with fairness and honour. She was a great lover of animals and nature, and my best friend lives on Elmwood Ave, and so we often walk our dogs around Roger Williams Park, and when I walk past the Betsey cottage, and I like to think she would like the animals and the nature there every time I see. Anyway, and the other thing that's really cool is looking through her will, in addition to the land that she bequeaths, there's one of the subclauses talks about allocating money for a Roger Williams fund to support Providence's poor. So, like, what an amazing woman. And again, so I'm going to pick out some of the highlights. So here's the will and last estate. Here's an inventory of stuff. I spent some time looking at this. And here then is, I think, the key to that question of her being of unsound mind, right? Like, remember we opened with this? Is that true? So she was placed under guardianship basically a few months before she passed away. But the will then is made a couple of years earlier. So the will stands, right? So her guardianship is just for the last couple of months of her life, and the will has been approved in 18, I want to say 16 because I'm a 17th century historian, but in 1868. And we know then that two of the people who were involved in the guardianship also witnessed the will and then testified when she dies that she was actually of sane mind. And that article about strange behavior, which was so exciting to me when I first read it, it appears in a bunch of different newspapers, not just Providence one. It makes the news in New York, right? And I was like, wow, this is East Coast news. But just a couple of days later, one of Betsey's friends basically writes to the editor and says, what have you just published? Like, why are you saying these things about my friend? And this is that letter. So it says, Mr. Editor, I read with much surprise in Saturday's press an article concerning Miss Betsey Williams of Cranston, lately deceased. The article was copied from the New York Tribune. The author of that paragraph must be a person of great inventive power. And I was like, oh, I love this. His imagination evidently having been cultivated at the expense of his veracity. So veracity. And she's like, I've known Miss Williams for the last 50 years, and until her last sickness have always found her a person of good common sense, with a clear sound mind, and one who always felt a keen interest in all and every event transpiring in the world. I was like, this is a Betsey I can get behind. Within the last year, her health failed and disease weakened her mental faculties, but at no time did she manifest any of the peculiarities which are so aptly described in the above-mentioned article. Her business matters were all arranged long before her sickness, and it's been her design for years to leave the homestead farm to the town of Cranston, because we're right on the border with Providence at this time. But when the property was taken into the limits of the city, she concluded to leave it to the city of Providence. And so this is it, right? Like, I just love this. Betsey Williams had a sound mind and a good heart. And I think that's a really powerful thing to think about. So going back to this then, right, that she wants to erect a monument to Roger Williams. And it's not as though when she dies, and I'm going to talk for another 5-10 minutes and we'll have plenty of time for questions. It's not as though she dies and like a few weeks later they open the park, right? Like, that's not how it happens. There's, again, from the newspapers and a couple of other sources, it's so complicated. You would think, right, like, she's bequeathing this land, her will's clear, we've cleared up all this stuff, but there's debate in Providence about what we should do with this. So there's all kinds of conflict with land speculators. There's people coming to steal wood from the property. There's a whole debate about, do we even need a park there? Because maybe we should do Field Point Park instead. Like, that's a much better place for a park. This sucks. It's not a good place. And Betsey's will was really specific on what the land could not be used for. So she said the land could not be used for any punitive or reformation purpose. So it couldn't be a prison or some type of hospital. It couldn't be a hospital for contagious or infectious diseases. It couldn't be a slaughterhouse, a piggery, a tannery, a bone or fat boiling establishment, or for, quote, any repulsive trade or occupation. So it can't have any of that. Thankfully for Betsey, that's not what happened. So the Providence Mayor's office described, quote, how the land bequeathed to the city is undoubtedly a portion of the original tract set off to Joseph Williams, so one of the sons, by the proprietors of the town of Providence, and a portion of this farm has never been conveyed by deed of sale, having descended through the several parties before named to Miss Williams. So it's through Roger and Mary's son Joseph that it basically passes through. And so this is from the original bounds of Providence that were granted to Roger Williams and Mary Williams from Canonicus and Mount Antinomii for what the town would be and where it's through Joseph's line. And what's really interesting is looking through the will, it doesn't cut out her surviving family entirely. It identifies her nephew, Charles Williams, who lives in New York, and the son of her deceased brother, Charles, as the sole executor. And there's other people named in the will, actually, that, again, we can talk about in the Q&A. And she leaves him basically the rest of the residue in her property, some of her household goods, her clothing, her carriage, her sleigh. As an equine historian, I'm like, what did that look like? And was split with heirs of her deceased nephew. And she's really well connected to so many people in Providence. And she leaves, other different bits and bobs in her will to various friends. And again, these aren't just like peripheral people in Providence. They are important people. And again, it's really fascinating to think about how she was connected. So despite all of these obstructions, Betsey's endowments thankfully did come to fruition. The City Council formally accepted her bequest on the 12th of February 1872. The park opened the same year, but it wasn't really until 5 years later that Betsey's bequest was fully honoured. Following her bequest, the park was named Roger Williams Park, and an imposing monument to its namesake was unveiled with much fanfare. The statue was designed, the statue that still stands today, I'll show you in a second, was designed and modelled by Frank Simmons in Rome, cast in bronze in Munich, and then finally cut by the Smith Granite Company. And I spent some happy hours just reading about the opening ceremony of the park, and I really wish I could have been there. I rarely say that about events in history, but I really wish I could have been there. An estimated 20,000 people attended the statue dedication, and I was like, what? I mean, sure, I'm going to believe it, right? Like, well, why not? We can say many people attended. There was a grand procession. There was a whole bunch of lectures on Roger Williams by professors at Brown University. And I was like, why? I mean, obviously why, right? She wanted it named Roger, but I was like, what about talking about her life? Anyway, there was a bunch of lectures on Roger Williams. There was music by the American band. The local Masonic Lodge was involved. They did a dedication. And then my favourite bit is that as the monument was unveiled, a bunch of local school children sang a newly written hymn called Roger Williams that was been written by another woman, Sarah Helen Whitman, and I've got the whole hymn, but I've just pulled out a few of my favourite lines. The lines include, and I'm not going to sing them because it's already raining, I, let the muse of history write, on a white stone his honoured name, loyal to liberty and light, first on Rhode Island's roll of fame, while may the muse of history place foremost amongst the just and free, his honoured name, wherein we trace the soul of law and liberty. And so there's this really fitting dedication to the statue. This is as a 17th century historian, photography does not exist in the 17th century, but the 19th century, we've got photos. It's so exciting to be able to see this. So you could see the Betsey Williams cottage in the background, and we can see Williams here. So at the base here, there's been some speculation. Is it Cleo, the muse of history, maybe, right? Like it suggests from here, right, may well the muse of history place, right? Is it that, or is it potentially a dedication to Betsey herself? So we have the woman here kind of reaching up, and Roger's there, and it basically says on his book, soul liberty, right? Honouring his work to religious freedom. So within 20 years, the park had quadrupled in size and attracted over 15,000 visitors daily. A history of the park that was published in 1897 described, quote, how Betsey would never cease to be esteemed for being a noble and generous public benefactor, which endeared her memory to the citizens of Providence. So I feel like that's our job now, right? Like, we have the cottage. Can we have some interpretive plaques outside? I know there's stuff that's just been reopened inside. Can we maybe have something to Betsey? And I say that quite seriously because I mentioned where Mary Williams was born at Worksop Priory in Nottinghamshire in England. And I've been lucky enough to connect with the Nottinghamshire Historical Association and the vicar of Worksop Priory. And when I was able to go inside the gatehouse, a couple of years ago when Mary was born, I was excited / horrified to see they had a whole like, probably like the size of that panel there, like huge like wall display inside the gatehouse where no one ever goes, about important people in Nottinghamshire history. And they had a panel on Roger Williams, and I was like, he had no connection to Nottinghamshire, it's where Mary's from. But it just literally said, Mary Williams, wife of Roger, was born here. Roger Williams did X, Y, and Z. And I was like, oh gosh. So we're going to have stuff to Mary in workshops. So my point is, like, can we now do something for Betsey a little bit more than just naming the cottage for her? Now, obviously, the park remains today. And, you know, I was doing some looking online, and they estimate like 1.5 million visitors go annually and enjoy, you know, 400 odd acres. So when the park was first opened, it was, you know, it was popular because of the inexpensive transport network. There was a lot of easy public access by horse-drawn trolleys. Now, the zoo then that still stands today is the 3rd oldest in America. The oldest is Central Park. Then there's one in Chicago, Lincoln Zoo, a couple of years later in the 1680s. But it's the 3rd oldest when it started in 1872. But it really wasn't until the 1890s that a huge construction effort in terms of landscaping, the menagerie, the carousel, the original carousel, and then it grows when basically Cranston donates land and private citizens donate it, and it grows and grows and grows. And so this is an early map, and I just want to show you some pictures of the park over time. This is what's described as a What Cheer Cafe, just a few years after being open. This is where the casino is now, as it's described. This is the original carousel from the 1890s. It looks pretty similar to today, right? Like I was there the other day. And then there's some really cool, they have a really extensive archival collection at the Roger Williams Park and Zoo that I encourage people to go and have a look at. This is the Elmwood Avenue entrance in the late 19th century. Here's an old picture of Betsey Williams' cottage, again, late 19th century. And there's no real need to include these images, but I'm just such an animal person that I had to. Baby Roger's first year. So they've got a little elephant called Roger. He arrived in the park in 1893. We have Palm, King of the Beasts, again, 1891. Like, this blew my mind, truthfully, more than the elephant. I was like, what? There's like these massive moose in the zoo, and obviously we've got the deer park, again, late 19th century. Pony teams, basically children who go for pony rides. And so Betsey then was buried at her request in the Williams family burial ground. And, you know, it just is sacred to the memory of Betsey Williams, and it describes, you know, who she, who she's from, and, you know, when she died. And I just feel like there's more that we could say about her life, and I'm going to talk for another minute or two. So Roger's statue still stands, and visitors can, I'm so happy to say, now tour Betsey's cottage in the ground. And so in 2022, it was the 150th anniversary of the park's conception. And the city officials had held a year-long celebration. And I was so happy that I could talk at that event about what I've talked to you a bit about tonight. And I gave a talk on, they wanted me to talk about Roger Williams. I was like, no. No. I said I'll talk about the women, right? And so I gave a talk from Mary Williams to Betsey, and it was really exciting. And Lorraine Spears, who's Narragansett, who runs the Tomaquat Museum, she did a really important land acknowledgement, thinking about the original inhabitants of the land. And, you know, that same year, obviously, they opened the Gateway and Visitors Centre. So it's been a real time, I think, of growth for the park. And I just want to leave you with this final thing then. From that newspaper article that was later discredited, one of the lines I really hope is true, right? It said that Betsey Williams, she was a lady who had her own ideas of life and lived in adherence with them. And I don't think that would have been possible without Mary's bequest in 1661, where she reconfirms the land evidence for the bounds of Providence, for Betsey, her great-great-great-great-granddaughter, to make this extraordinary bequest in the 19th century. So it's 8:02, and I will pause there, and I'll happily take some questions on anything that I've said this evening. Yeah, and I'm going to come to you so I can hear you if people have questions. Do you have a microphone? I don't know if you want people to ask on a microphone or if they can hear, okay. Does anyone have any questions? And if you don't, that's fine. I can take them one-on-one. Yeah.
Was divorce unusual at that time?
I mean, yes and no is the honest answer, right? Like, it does happen, but it's still frowned upon. Look at the fact that it's such a big deal that he's fathering children out of wedlock, right? That is a big thing. So, I mean, divorce happens. It happens in the 17th century too, right? Like, in a way that we don't often talk about, right?
Brought up by the woman?
Yeah. You know, there's an amazing article that I teach a class called Crime and Dissent in 17th Century New England, and one of the articles I set is how in the 17th century, I'm just going to tell you, a woman could divorce her husband if he was impotent and did not provide, like, sexual fulfillment. And so no one thinks about that, right? Like, we think about, like, the Pilgrims or the Puritans as deeply religious, but, like, there's a real sense that, like, women had that power. So absolutely, like, it's not common, but it certainly happens, and I would say the same is true into the 19th century. Yeah, really good question, and you can see that, you know, James really did deserve to be divorced multiple times. Yeah, great question. Yeah, other questions? Yeah.
Yes, you talked about the expansion of the park, and I'm assuming that's with the abutting property owners.
Yeah.
Who would
Bequeath, yeah.
But that had to probably, I mean, I can't imagine someone, even in the 1900s or so, leaving just their plot of land to the park.
Yeah.
How did that end up getting large swaths of additional land?
Yeah, the answer is I've not looked into that extensively. Like, my interest has been, maybe.
City bought the land.
Yeah, Yeah. So again, I think that makes it possible to have, like, the bounds that we have today, and it grows, right, like, over time, etc. But it's such an amazing park to wander around. Like, I think that every time I go, like, right in the heart there, and yeah, it's a really cool place. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, good question. Thank you.
I just have to tell you a horse story.
Oh, I'm always game for that.
Roger Williams.
Oh.
They used to have pony rides. I don't know
Yeah.
if they still do.
I think so.
But that was my favorite ride at the park.
Oh.
And in the wintertime, the ponies lived in the barn on the property. And my great uncle, who did not have any children of his own, would take me to visit the park in the wintertime. And he would say, "Would you like to go see the ponies?" I didn't realize until many years later that he was, like, slipping the caretaker a $10 bill so she can say hi to the ponies.
Oh, I love that. Oh, you
But
know.
I went to see the ponies in the wintertime every year.
Oh, you and me would be the same people going to see the ponies. I'm always, you know, like, horses. I was saying, like, this work, I gave a talk a few years ago on the Narragansett Pacer as the first American breed of horse here. It's a big part of my research, and so anytime anyone has anything horse related, I'm there. Yeah, thank you.
Is the house still open in the park?
Yeah, it was closed for quite a while.
I think it's still closed because it's not safe for a lot of people to be in because it's never been upgraded.
But you can, I believe, if you email I forgot the lady's name. I can look the email up in a minute. You are able to get in there. I think you just have to book an appointment to tour it. And I believe, I don't think I'm oversharing that the hope is to make it more accessible. Like that's the plan. And that was certainly the plan in 2022 when they had the big anniversary. Yeah, but it's cool. Like it's really worth a visit, even if you just peer through the window. I'll come here and then across. Yeah.
Do you think that domestic violence was a real problem back then?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, it was a huge thing. And again, like, let me draw a comparison between the 19th century and the 17th century. The next door neighbours to Roger and Mary in Providence were involved in a domestic violence case, right? That Joshua and Jane were in. They knew Roger Williams and Mary Williams in the 17th century in Salem. They came down. Jane Varin was a huge religious follower of Roger Williams, wanted to hear the word in Roger's house. Her husband Joshua, and I'm quoting from the source, beat her with an inch of her life for going to worship with Roger Williams next door. Their houses are literally next door. And it's one of the early court cases in Providence, and they're debating. It's legal in the 17th century to correct a wife or a servant, but not excessively, I know, right? Not excessively. So the case turns on not necessarily the domestic violence, but for what he's correcting her for, her religious freedom. Right? Like if you founded a place, a year or so before, that is on religious freedom, the whole case is what's more important, the patriarchy or religious freedom. Now the good news is they rule religious freedom is the most important thing. So it's a huge victory, right? Her religious freedom is more important than obeying her husband. The sad news is that he drags her back up to Salem, and it's a really sorry tale. A professor at Providence College called Margaret Manchester has just written a book on the Joshua and Jane Varin, that's their names, controversy. And it's a really good example of that in the 17th century. So yes, we see it from the 17th into the 19th. Yeah, good question. I saw a hand over here, yeah.
What is the age of the house? When was it built?
Oh, do you know what? Do you know? It's
It was,
there was debate about it, right?
yeah, it was built by James's father as a wedding present for James and Mary.
Yeah.
when he was married.
So,
So it's
1870, it'd be in
1773.
yeah, so late 18th century, yeah. Because one of the things that people have been like, was this the original house that Roger and Mary, I don't know, great if it was, no. The house where Roger Williams and Mary Williams no longer stands, it was burnt to the ground in 1676 in the midst of King Philip's War. And Roger and Mary basically spend the last few years of their life potentially living with some of their children. So their house used to be along what is now North Main Street, opposite Roger Williams National Memorial. There's a plaque on the site there. So that's not true. That like if you ever hear like that's Roger Williams' house, that's not the case. It's a late 18th century house.
Joseph's house was across the street from Betsey Williams' College.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, like the Roger Williams Family Association has done some amazing work on like all of this stuff. I really do suggest like looking at some of the stuff that they've done. Yeah, any other questions on anything? And if anyone has a private question that they want to answer publicly, I'll hang around for a few minutes, that's fine too.
One last question. You had mentioned Roger Williams had a trading post down here.
Mm-hmm.
Where was it?
Do you know where Smith's Castle is that? Yeah, Cocum Scusser, yeah, that's where it was.
Well, shall we just begin?
Oh yeah, my pleasure, thank you. Thank you.
Will you be back after you publish your book? Talk about it.
Yeah, I'll be an incentive to finish. My editor is constantly, it's written, like I have a first full draft of my Roger book done. I just have to make some final edits. The footnotes now have to be footnotes, just not weird notes for myself that other people can actually understand. So it's almost done, yeah. Roger Williams is cool, I feel excited about it. And Mary too, right, like that article, I feel more excited about that. But yeah, I definitely will.
Can anyone order your classes?
Yes, you just need to contact the registrar. We often have people order our classes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love it when people order my classes. I teach a class on a whole semester long class called Roger Williams and His World. Next year I'm teaching for the second time Mary Williams and Her World, Women in the 17th Century. I teach a class on crime and dissent in 17th century New England. I teach a class on witchcraft in the Atlantic world. I teach a pirate history class. I teach a class on slavery in New England. I teach a class on indigenous history. Yeah, so what are some of my classes? Yeah, I love that. So, yeah.
Tell us more about the slaves.
Oh, yeah, sure, yeah. If people need to leave, they're more than welcome to. It's complicated, right? So, there's two pieces of information I want to share with you. So, think of the chronology. Providence is founded in 1636, right? almost as soon as the town is founded, Roger Williams goes away because the Pequot War is stirring, right? And Roger, again, leaves Mary immediately, right? We've got a letter where he's like, I just founded this town, I've got to go, I'm leaving Mary in charge. That's not what it says, but it's kind of what it says, right? So the war comes to an end the following year in 1637. And a bunch of Pequot people, women and children mainly, have been captured at the end of the war. And we have a bunch of letters that Roger writes to John Winthrop up in Massachusetts, who just banished him, right, a year or so before. They stay in correspondence, and a couple of the letters mention what should happen to the Pequot survivors, mainly the women and children. And there's a bunch of them who are being moved from what is Connecticut up to Boston. And at some point along the way, whether it's down here in Narragansett country, whether it's up in Providence, it's not clear, Roger knows about them. And we're not sure, there's a couple of sources that suggest there's maybe 40 or 50 of them. And Williams writes to John Winthrop Jr. requesting one of the young boys with red about his neck. And he says in the letter, you know, I won't be peremptory in my choice, I'll have him or any that you want. I only request that you would give him a name. I know his mother and I know his 2 siblings are with you. So the status of that child is truly unclear, right? Like, I'm being really deliberate in my choice of words saying that child was unfree. And we know that child comes to live with the Williams family. So 1 year after Providence is founded, on the premise of freedom, an unfree Pequot child is taken from his mother and siblings. Is that child enslaved? Is that child indentured as a servant? It's not clear is the answer. Roger later writes that he believes they should be indentured for a period of time, and then if they're not going to rebel again, to give them their freedom. But truthfully, in reality, that's not the case, right? There's no law on slavery on the books in Rhode Island until the mid-17th century, and this is 1637, so it's not coming from a decade or two. And even when they do pass a law in the 1650s, it says nothing about native peoples. So we know that native slavery was prevalent. That particular boy's status is unclear. Now, a year or so after Williams requests this child, in another letter, he references my native man, my native servant called Will, right? Is it the same person? Maybe, maybe not, right? So he's definitely got one unfree child in his house at the point where he's just got 2 young children of his own, right? 1 year later, he's got this unfree boy, and then he has Will. He also has a Dutch servant in his house, William Clewson, who's with him for a while. But the kind of key piece is not the slavery in his house. We've got that unfree boy, but it comes about in 1676 at the end of King Philip's War, when Providence Williams, his son, so the town's called Providence and the son's called Providence, which is confusing. The son, Providence, uses his sloop, right? He's a trader. He takes Mary and a bunch of other women and children down to Aquidneck Island while Providence is basically burnt to the ground. And the letters survive at Rhode Island Historical Society in Providence that then basically talk about what to do with the Pokanoket, Wampanoag, and other allies, the captives. And so Roger Williams basically signs front and center agreeing to sell them in slavery in the Caribbean, and we know that his son Providence is involved with his sloop. He's a trader in that. So they profit directly from the sale of native peoples. And the extent of native slavery in the 1670s is so... It's not just a few people that are sent down there, so much so that in 1676, they pass a law in the English colonies in the Caribbean basically saying, you're sending so many enslaved natives, we just can't. Like, Barbados passes this act saying, like, you're sending so many native peoples down into slavery. So he definitely has an unfree child in his house. The status is ambiguous, but he most certainly profits from selling native peoples into slavery. And if you're interested in this, I have an amazing recommendation from a good friend of mine at Brown University, Linford Fisher. He's writing a book on native slavery. He's written a journal article called Dangerous Designs, the Barbados Indian Importation Act, I think it is, of 1676 I just described to you. But even more importantly, he is working with tribal partners to create a database cataloguing indigenous slavery around the Atlantic world. And that's about to launch, and it's called Stolen Relations. And so indigenous partners have really pushed him to think about slavery from a native perspective, right? It's not just about the economy and whatever, but it's about stealing people from their families and their homelands. And that term stolen relations really hits with Roger Williams when you think about that boy in 1637. He knows his mum's still alive and 2 siblings, so stolen from the family, so stolen relation. But the fact that he's requesting for Winthrop to erase his indigenous identity by renaming him reinforces that it's not just physical stealing of people, it's cultural genocide, right? Like trying to take away native identity and taking away native peoples from their land. So it's a really uncomfortable example of Williams being involved in that project of stolen relations. So I highly recommend checking out Linford Fisher's work. It's groundbreaking. It really is. Yeah. Yeah. Any more questions? No, I feel like that was a dark moment to end on. My apologies. Well, thank you again for having me, and I'll happily take more questions. Thank you, Rhoda.